Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's Debbie Tucker again. I just spoke to many of you in the opening session, and it is my pleasure to get us rolling with our first breakout session, Managing Remote Workforce with one of my very favorite people in the world, Bill Krizner. So when I got the chance to introduce him, I said, well, gosh, what am I going to say? I always tell people the first time that I met Bill or had the pleasure of sitting in a conference with him and listened to a presentation, I think it was 2000. So I'm going to say that rather than date myself and say 20 years ago. I ended up sitting in the first row because there were no other seats. And, you know, that means I was a couple minutes late to the session. And who wants to sit in the first row? And I took pages and pages and pages of notes on his presentation. My poor hands were sore by the time that presentation was over. I took so many notes, and I was like, this is someone that I need to work with because there's so much that I can learn from him. And Bill is a human resource attorney who specializes in nonprofits and has a love for Florida State in general, because that's where he got his law degree, and manages to still love Florida State football despite our many bad years. But it has been a pleasure to work with him over the last 20 years. And as the PTAC, we knew we wanted to bring him into the fold because, again, there's so much that we can learn from him. And so I'm so happy today to be able to moderate this and have the chance to introduce him and expose so many of you to his brilliance, because he's not like a regular lawyer, he's a cool lawyer. So we are going to, without further ado, turn it over to Bill Krizner.
That is quite the introduction. I never know what he's going to say, so I appreciate that. Thanks for the kind words, and thanks for the 2 decades together. But it is so great to be with everyone today. Before we jump in our cool session here, just a couple housekeeping things to make sure everybody's mindful of. The session is being recorded, and so that is an important thing to note. We want to encourage you all to participate. I think there are more than 100 folks with us, so that can prove a little challenging on these Zoom calls, but probably the easiest way is if you don't mind asking your questions or making your comments in the chat box. And I hope most of you are familiar and comfortable with that in the Zoom format. But just go ahead and write those questions down. I would say to kind of avoid using names or using too many specifics because this is a recorded session. The other thing is that we are keeping everybody muted, so if you had some reason to be heard, please let us know. But we're just trying to make sure that this is as clean a presentation as it can be for everyone involved. So welcome to 2020, and it has impacted all of our lives in so many different ways, and even saying that feels very empty, doesn't it? We're all tired, we're all exhausted, we're all ready for this to pass, but we have to wait, and we still have some more hurdles that we're facing. And so today, what I want to do is I want to discuss a very important topic to most everybody on the line, and that is, how do I manage a remote workforce, particularly, and you see the big scary red letters there, during COVID-19. And so we're going to talk about this, and the way we're going to go about it is that we're going to discuss it from 2 different perspectives. One, the primary area that we're going to spend time is talking about the practical management. You know, how can I make this be something that works not only for me as the leader, but also for my employee? You know, how can this be a 2-way street that's productive and, most importantly, fulfill our mission and serve the people that we're tasked with serving? And so we're going to talk a lot about that at the beginning portion of our training today. But as Debbie mentioned, I'm also one of those terrible L words, lawyers, right? Again, a good guy lawyer, but I'm a lawyer nonetheless. So part of my role when I speak is to make sure I share with you potential legal concerns, you know, potential pitfalls and ways that it can create real problems and real issues for you. So without further ado, we're going to jump in. Where are things right now? You know, nobody seems to quite know. In fact, even on this question, you know, I get this all the time, is thinking about moving back to the physical workforce, but we're not sure. And you know, what percentage of the American workplace is working from home currently? And you see numbers all over the board with the different surveys that have been done by, you know, groups like the Chamber or SHRM and whatnot. But I would say when you look at sort of the whole, that number is probably right around 40 to 50% of people today in September are working from home. And it's a pretty big number, right? And obviously you have to factor in things like industries. Certain industries allow for it, certain industries don't. Everybody on the line today has some options. You have some fluidity as to what's best. And so that's probably why you decided to come and join us for our conversation. But the other thing to note is that before we added the little red font during COVID-19, we did this presentation many times over the last couple decades, because working remote and having a remote workplace is not something that's new. In fact, there's been a great growth rate, especially in our industry, in the professional industry. I looked it up. In fact, I wrote down there's been a 91% increase in the number of people working from home over the last decade when you compare 2020 to 2010. And so it raises lots of questions. And by the way, lots of people want to work from home. And that number, if you're wondering, is 70% on surveys. 70% of people say, yeah, sign me up. I want to work from the house. Although many of those that said that before are now finding that maybe it's not quite as good as it seemed, right? The grass isn't always greener, as they say. So the question becomes, is it a good idea or is it not? And that's what we really want to explore today. Again, looking at the next 6 to 8 months, sort of getting through the pandemic. But for some of you, and a lot of workplace, a lot of our clients, they've actually opened the door now to considerations of beyond that. This has been working really well for us, and we think we're actually more productive in this sort of hybrid remote setting. And so we are entertaining conversations with groups now that say we think we want to continue doing that same thing. So we're looking at it short term, but we're also looking at it long term. We'll go next. So what are we looking at here? Well, a couple things early. Model and reward the right behaviors, right? And so I want to start with that idea of model, because it really does start with each of you. I presume that if you're joining me today, you're probably a CEO, perhaps a board president, perhaps the head of your HR function. And so, quick story, one of our clients, the CEO, the business owner, decided that everybody should go back to the physical work site. Well, everybody except her, because she actually has great anxiety and great worry about the pandemic. And so she works from home and everybody else is at the physical location working with one another. And you can only imagine, I don't know this for a fact, but I can imagine that they are talking about her, right? Not leading by example. Now, I know her personally and for a long time, and she's a workaholic. So she's probably working, as we'll talk about in a moment, even harder, frankly, remotely than she does when she's there at the physical site. But the fact that she's not there sends a really bad message. So whatever you decide, right, I would say to you as leaders of your respective agencies, it is really important for you to sort of set that model, right? If you're worried and you're fearful, and look, nobody's here to judge, and you decide, hey, working from home is better, that's probably a truism for the rest of your team as well. So make sure, and it's, by the way, I'm not proposing a one-size-fits-all. We're going to talk about some of those issues as we move as well. Reward. So this is really important too. We'll talk about this, but right now, I think the biggest challenge that working from home presents is that it pushes and challenges the amount and quality of communication that's taking place throughout your organizations, okay? Truly. And so when we say reward the right behaviors on this slide, it's really important to talk and give examples, specific examples of your employees and of your staff that are doing the right thing, right? That are doing it well, working remotely and doing it very well. And by lifting those people up, some of the other staff members roll their eyes and go, oh yeah, it's a Tara, that's how she is. But at the same time, what you're doing is you're elevating and sort of setting that standard of expectation. So two very early points, but one is, imitate, right? Make sure that you're setting the example so that others imitate you in terms of what decisions you're making. And two, really recognizing and lifting up others. Well, we'll go next. So, the first question that I get a lot of times is, what do you think about going ahead and going remote? Or the question is, what about staying remote versus requiring everybody to go back?
Well, you'll see on this little slide that my question is always this. It's a question back, right? My answer is a question, if you will. And that is, how do you measure the employee in question's success? How do you measure their value to the organization, okay? Whether somebody can work remotely for a sustained period of time really has a lot to do with the job in question, right? And so if the job is something that can be measured in terms of its success tangibly, there are outcomes that we can see, right? That tends clearly to translate better to this remote status compared to other roles. And so just as an example, I'll give you a couple examples, right? Clearly, if you have a bookkeeper that works for your organization, he or she probably has a kind of job that translates rather well from the office to his or her home. As long as the technology, right, the software, the access, et cetera, translates and it can be used in a second area, that position you probably already brought them home and it works beautifully, right? You probably don't have a lot of issues, at least positionally. But I don't know, pick another position, a police officer, okay? It is rather hard for a police officer to work remotely, right? They cannot capture the bad guys from sitting in the luxury of their chairs or their couches. The position simply doesn't translate. And then you have others, and I think the ones that we wrestle with, I mean, just to be very frank, right, in our world, are the ideas of what happens when it's a, quote, caseworker, right? It's somebody that provides a direct level of care. But in this day and age, they can't really do that, or at least do it very effectively. And so now we've converted to this sort of virtual format. So now let's say she, doesn't have to be at the office to sort of meet people per se, but she does still collaborate a lot with partners, with others. And, in that situation, it gets a little harder. So, you know what, I make the argument as the employee, I just want to do this from home, and I can meet with folks, I can advocate for parents, I can meet with faculty, I can do all these things from the house just the same as I can at the office. Except for the fact that when you run into a problem or a challenge that you haven't had before, what do you most often do pre-pandemic? You probably walk down the hall and talk with others, right? You got support. There was a network. There was a spirit of collaboration that was very important in terms of your effectiveness. And so when you start getting into these more hybrid roles that at first glance seem to easily translate to work from home status, you find when you dig just a little bit deeper, it's not quite that easy, okay? And so what I'm driving at here is the idea that first and foremost, I've got to look at the position. Is it a position that translates? And the good positions that translate usually have measurable outcomes. I can see what they're doing, and the type of environment working from home really doesn't impact sort of those results. We'll go next. So the first question that comes along with all of this, right? So now we've talked about the position a little bit. But this is a tough one, and it's a kind of a hard one if you're the CEO of your agency. And that is this idea and the spirit of culture of trust. Do we currently, and that's an important word, currently, but do we currently operate in a culture of trust? Does this actually exist, right? What type of cultural integrity or cultural ethics do we have in our office right now? And this is really important, because if you work in a culture where before the pandemic, there was a lot of tension, there was a lot of conflict, there was a lot of gossip, there was a lot of people that just frankly you couldn't trust, translate that and convert that now to work from home status. You can't see them, you don't have much interaction with them. That's a bad place to be, right? And so we do have to ask the question, when we start to get into deciding who is and who's not, can the person be trusted? Not just our culture at large, but the individual in this position that we're looking at. Is it somebody, when I look back at their track record, that they have been somebody who, when they give me their word, they're good for it, right? Or is this somebody historically that hasn't done it very well? Now, I'm going to put my lawyer hat on very quickly. And that is, as we start to make decisions about who is and who's not, that's where we start to introduce the possibility of liability. Because while your rationale might be, well, you know, with Satara, I trust her instinctively. I worked with her for 10 years. She's fantastic, etc. I'm fine with her working from the house. But then with Debbie, right? Look, Debbie just is not a very good person. I don't trust her further than I can throw her. Like, she needs to be in the office next to me so I can keep my eye on her. But when Satara and Debbie in the exact same role, or even similar roles to one another, right? Suddenly we start to look and say there's some differences between them. I won't bore you with my whole protected class employment law spiel right now, but I will tell you that you should know those things, right? And so race and gender and age and sexual orientation and disability, all those things that the law protects, when there's a difference in those folks, we always think about that when we talk about, you know, firing somebody or not hiring somebody. But even making decisions based upon working conditions where you give one person an advantage over somebody else, now you have to be able to explain that distinction. And unfortunately, the idea of sort of trust or integrity is a hard thing sometimes to prove up. So we do want to make sure that we're being very, very careful and very smart on that front. Now, we'll talk in a bit about accommodations. Most everybody on this line is intimately familiar with the idea of reasonable accommodations under the ADA in a lot of different contexts. But remember, that also applies to your workplace. It also applies to your employees. And so there are times whenever I can give an accommodation, for example, a work from home reasonable accommodation to somebody because of their disability. And that doesn't sort of require me or lock me down to do the same for everyone else. But it's really important to kind of think those things through because it can open the door to problems. So let's move to the next slide, supervisor support. Okay, so this is a little wrinkle too, okay? So we already established that kind of the best employees to have working from home tend to be those that are autonomous, kind of working on their own, right? They're trusted employees, if you will. Yet, at the same time, when we send people home, not because of the individual, but because of the context of the work, meaning that they're working remotely, there's naturally now going to be a separation, sort of an imposed separation between the supervisor and the employee, okay? And that's where this little kind of conflict we've had to deal with in a lot of cultures comes up. So I was in great standing. I'll keep picking on Satara, right? Satara was in great standing with me as the boss, Debbie not so much. So I'm good with Satara. She's going to work from home, right? And so what happens is I now, as a supervisor, start asking her more questions, okay? I want more interaction with her than I have before. Why? I just have a certain anxiety and uneasiness that I'm not around her enough. And so what happens, you know, not intentionally, but Satara starts to feel like, wait a minute, like, why is Bill micromanaging me now, you know? And we've seen a lot of that kind of frustration that starts to take place. Sometimes it's the opposite. Sometimes the supervisor is like out of sight, out of mind, you know, and doesn't check in on her at all. And Satara's going, gosh, I guess I'm not that important. I guess my work doesn't matter as much because Bill, at least when I was at the office, would pop in once a day and say, hey, and ask me what I was up to. And now I never hear from him, right? So it's important that we get in front of those natural points of conflict or natural points of division that can result. How do we do that? Well, like always, we just need to put it on the table. Okay, that's one thing I think we've all learned in life is that it's far better to go ahead and sort of talk about things in advance because it helps mitigate against the blow up or the problems later. And just a couple practical examples of what I'm talking about here is that I think that the supervisor employee, probably long before you guys ever even went sort of the virtual setting, and it's not too late, but I think having a real conversation with each and every employee, particularly those that really are naturally autonomous, high performers, et cetera. Here is one of those things, which is what we call the, sort of the block of uninterrupted time, okay? And so this is really important. I'll give an example at my office, which is that I have a professional that's there that does a multitude of things, but one of the things is that she's responsible for billing, right? The invoices, et cetera. And it is a mind-boggling process in terms of how all that works. And so in any given day, right, at that time of the month, I should say, like where she needs about a day and a half to get all the bills prepared and out the door, if she's constantly being interrupted, right, with lots of questions and emails and directions, et cetera, it can't happen. And so we know that, we understand that, and there's a time where she has to lock off. Well, the same thing now when you have somebody working virtual, there's a real concern because somebody who does a hard job, right? Hopefully all your jobs are hard, but a job where you have to be laser focused, that individual does have to put the do not disturb kind of concept in play. And so as I'm talking with the employee about this new virtual sort of existence and remote work arrangement, it's one of the points that I'm going to talk about is let's discuss those blocks of time, the blocks that you need to be productive and to focus. And perhaps even so much so that we should establish those. When is it during the week? Is there a normal time? There probably was a normal time when you're at your physical office, but now that you're at home, when do you need just to be sort of left alone? How can we communicate that to one another so that I'm not frustrated that I can't reach you, and or you're not frustrated that I'm bothering you during these really important times? And not every job has that. I mean, some jobs are just, fluid. It's always going, always going, always going. But you know what I mean by that, right? The second practical conversation that I think should flow with a supervisor and employee in a remote setting is the idea of the timeliness of reply, right? What I mean by that is the communications. Citing back to that person who now is very anxious and on kind of overdrive. I can't get a hold of Mike. Where is Mike? And the last time I talked to Mike was like 15 minutes ago. And so I'm overwhelming him with a second email or a third email. I haven't heard back from you. When are you gonna have this? And you're seeing that kind of behavior, that micromanagement supervision go on to overdrive, and it's not healthy. And so again, establishing some baseline in terms of email communication as an example, right? So if I send you an email, let's kind of commit to each other that we're going to operate on the half day rule, right? Meaning that if I send it to you in the morning, that you respond to me by lunch. And same thing, if you email me in the morning, I'll respond to you by lunch. And the same thing, after lunch, before the close of the day. For most people, that's a very reasonable kind of turnaround. But talking about those things now is very important because it's different than where we were before. Before, right, you would simply walk down the hall and pull somebody aside or walk into their office. So making those adjustments by talking them through, I think can be really helpful, and it can help avoid, again, some of these problems and these blow-ups that we're seeing within remote situations. The next slide talks about autonomy. And I've kind of already mentioned this to some degree, right? There's two aspects. I've already addressed kind of the job, the functional autonomy that does exist in certain positions that doesn't exist in others. So the job is one thing, but the second piece of it really is the person, him or herself, right? How much autonomy, how autonomously can Bill operate, right? And it doesn't mean just because I'm not an autonomous person that I'm not productive. There are plenty of professional people who work in some of your offices that frankly put out great work product, but they do need a lot more hand holding, right? And so we have to, we'll talk about here in just a moment, we have to create some understanding about that accountability. What are the deliverables going to be? How much involvement do I need to have with each individual person during this very strange year to help them feel as though they're supported to get the outcomes that we're driving for? Okay, next slide. So let's talk about the challenges. And so I love this image, by the way, because some of us are like, that's me, right? That's me. So I've been doing a lot of trainings virtually, and most of you have been as well. And I've had all kinds of crazy things happen on these Zoom rooms. But one of the things that I've noticed, and I'll just give you a good example. On one single call, okay, I had Mother Goose. That's what I teasingly and affectionately called her, because she was in there and I was trying to train on race discrimination and sexual harassment and all these things. And I counted because it became so irritating to me and so distracting. But there were, in a 1 hour training, there were 12 different times when it felt like 12 different young children, but like, I don't know if she was running an orphanage. I don't know what was going on, but she had a lot of kids, and they would come up and whisper something in her ear or give her something to look at, to edit, to whatever was going on. I don't know. But I felt as though I had walked into her homeschool rather than her being in my training session. And it's really distracting, but that wasn't my bigger concern. My bigger concern was, how in the world is that employee frankly able to be a contributor in a meaningful way to the mission of that particular organization? And hopefully that was just an odd moment in the day and she didn't have care. There wasn't anything else she could do. I'm not being too critical, but it wasn't a very good reflection of what you might expect. And on that same call, I nicknamed him General Bark, but General Bark, he must have been raising up an army of dogs to take over the world, because he could not get his audio. And I kept saying, let's stop for a moment. Can I remind everybody to mute their backgrounds, right, et cetera. But the dogs, I mean, it was just this overwhelming sound of dog barking. And I had the same thought. Yes, it's distracting for this training, but good Lord, how in the world that guy is able to focus on any given day on productive work, or to have telephone calls or anything else, it's really hard to imagine. So this is where it gets weird, because usually the lawyer is saying, stay out of people's personal lives at all costs, right? Stay out of their personal lives. This is a big exception to that. And we have to be careful, because there are protected classes like family status, right? Like disabilities, like other things. But here's the thing. When somebody comes up to you and asks to work remotely, or you're in a situation like a pandemic where you're going to send people home or require them to work remotely, I think it's important to say, what distractions might exist at your house, okay? And that's a perfectly legal question to ask. And that's an important question, in my opinion, to ask. That way, you're not saying, or I know, those kind of things are not acceptable. They're not legal at all. But if the individual then says, well, I do have 2 kids, or I do have 3 kids at the house, then what you do is you engage in a dialogue. And most of you are so capable as leaders. I love working with you all. But you have a high emotional IQ, right? We're all going to get through this thing together, but we have to do it together. And so knowing that you have several kids, when he shares about his wife who is working, but she has to be out of the house, having conversations and dialogue about what we can do to best support them. And I'm not talking about paying for the cost of a babysitter, but what I mean is talking about how the functions of their job, the requirements and expectations of their job, do or don't sort of gel or meet with those demands at home is really important. Helping them think through, when can I create and carve out certain pockets in the day or pockets in the week where I can be productive? And I've heard some executive directors say to me, well, they're grown-ups, Bill. They should be able to figure that out. And I don't say it this way because they pay me, but I say, in my mind, I say, how dare you? Like that's heartless, right? Because if you're a great leader, the number one thing for you is that you want to drive the success of your employees. You want to help them however you can be successful in their roles. And so now we walk into this very strange time in a pandemic, right? Where nobody's ever been here before. None of us have ever been here before. And we're all completely off kilter, and we're all trying to make sense of things. And the leader, the person who's supposed to want me to be successful, has abandoned me. And so some people are more receptive than others, but I think that this is one of those conversations that too many people have avoided. And yes, it may feel a little paternal, but remember, your workplace has now changed. You're actually governing, and it sounds weird to say, but you're governing their homes, right? Like, you're making sure that during those 6 or 8 or 10 hours that they're as productive as they can possibly be with these very strange obstacles that they're facing. So don't be shy in having those conversations, okay? In fact, I've got to tell you, again, most of you are very familiar with the ADA. Oftentimes, people come and ask for the reasonable accommodation of working from home. We've had 3 different situations in the last month where people who were, the whole staff was working virtually. They've actually come forward and said, I need the reasonable accommodation of being allowed to come back to the physical workspace because I'm not able to perform my job at the house. Most of them had disabilities that caused them to be distracted very easily. And working, trying to work around, the multiple children or the partner who has another job or too small a space, it just wasn't allowing them to perform the essential functions. And so we've actually had to turn off alarms and allow some people to come with disabilities to come back into the normal work environment so that they can focus. So again, lots to take in there. Probably the big takeaway, though, from work and family boundaries is really not being afraid to have the conversation and to help that person. You're not their psychiatrist or their therapist, but to help that person sort of think through the rhythms of their day and what would be most productive for him or her and for you and the agency. So feel free to post any questions or comments that you might have about any of these points that we're raising. Second challenge, we'll go to the next slide, is team cohesion, okay? And so I got to tell you that virtual work, for the most part, remote work is really good, and it's frankly, as I mentioned before, turns out it's actually in some situations more productive for what we call the islands, right? People whose job are kind of the islands, meaning that they just don't have a whole lot of interplay with others. I don't know, they're an editor, for example, right? We found that by saving 2 hours of commute time, they're actually far more productive and happier, and the work quality of what they're putting out is better when they just sit on their couch and they edit, right, on their computers, on their laptop, and the product is very good. They seem to have more energy and more focus. So that's rare, especially in your world. You don't have many islands, okay? Because most teams are really founded in deeply intertwined collaborative relationships, right? And those teams and those positions are the ones that have struggled the most. So I don't know it's necessary that they need to struggle quite so much. So I will say this, though. I don't think those positions, right now, if you're going, that's kind of my team, I would say to you, if that's your gut, I don't think those positions will last long term, in other words, post-COVID, working remotely. And so, the sooner you kind of have that conviction, probably in a lot of ways, the better, because you're going to see, and we have seen, a lot of people getting more and more comfortable with the concept of working from their house. And so you can expect that you're going to have some tension, conflict, maybe even some fights with employees when you're ready to have them return and they're saying, I don't think so, and I can do my job just as well from home. So be prepared and already be thinking through that. So how do we muddle through this mess when we are so deeply intertwined and while we do rely so much on the meetings and the in-person stuff? Well, of course, the answer is more regularity. Doesn't surprise anybody. But what I found is that many of our clients, they think that they're doing a much better job than they really are. And what I mean by that is most all of our clients, and I imagine you're included in this, but they have weekly team meetings, right? So everybody gathers and you have, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 people, whatever it is, you have the full team on. And it's similar to this kind of training, or you've got the little Zoom capsules up, and oftentimes there's way too much talk being done by the executive director or the team leader. They're not engaging. We'll talk about that in a moment too. They're not really engaging people as much, and without participation, most prolonged meetings fail pretty miserably. But where I see the failure isn't really in those meetings as much as it is the one-on-one virtual time, okay? And be mindful about this. I would say lessen how often and how long your big group meetings are, okay? probably in a very different way than you do when in the old days when you were in person. And I would say less than that, but as leaders, really push what we call partnered time, okay? And it's the idea that in these small teams, oftentimes it's just one-on-one, it's two people, that they're actually doing Teams or Zoom or whatever your platform is, but they're actually doing this, okay? And somebody says, well, if you have a telephone call, that's fine. Frankly, very few people are even doing that. Most times what we're doing is back to utter efficiency. I'm just going to email. I'm going to email Satara. It'll be faster. She can just get back to me when she wants to. That way I'm not bothering her. And we're collapsing things to this electronic dialogue. And you all know what happens when we collapse things to an electronic dialogue, right? The human piece goes away and things fall through the cracks. And people, by the way, aren't really communicating. And so I get an email that's too curt and I read into it and I think, oh, Mike's really mad at me. And that creates all these waves and all this frustration that should never have happened. Because normally Mike and I would have been in the same room having a conversation about things, and I could read, his facial expressions. I could listen to his tone. I mean, all those things we always talk about. So, praise God, the one thing we do have going for us is technology. Okay, and as frustrated as we might get with Zoom and Teams and all these different things, we have it, right? And so take the time, in fact, encourage or maybe even require these partnered teams, right, to do Zoom, to have this kind of interpersonal conversation about things and to do it far more often. I can tell you that it really does make a big difference. But I bet some of you, I can't see most of you, but I bet if you raised your hand right now, I said, how many of you have had some kind of either express or more likely implied sort of conflict or misunderstanding, in this new remote world? Most of you would say I have. And I'll bet if I said, gosh, if people weren't just relying on texts and emails, do you think some of that could have been avoided? And I think most of you would say yes. Susan says, if you have time, can you talk more about how to manage a situation when an employee decides that they don't want to return to the workplace when it's been deemed safe? I will, Susan. I'm going to make sure that I reserve at least 10 or 15 minutes at the end to get into the legal side of that, because I think that's a really important question, and it's one that is more on the legal side than it is practical. So hold that one. I promise I'll come back and answer it before the end. Let's move to the next one. Crunch time. Deadlines are more dangerous. I don't know if you realize this or not. I bet some of you go, oh yeah, I just lived through one of these. But what happens is that remote work tends to fuel procrastination, okay? Why is that? Because we found all of these like amazing hours. For those of you who work in more urban environments, you've saved an hour and 15, an hour and a half commute time now. It's kind of like, yeah, there's not really that much rush, like I kind of get to this stuff when I get to it. But then the flip side of the remote work, it's sort of like the double curse, is that, oh my gosh, the grant is due tomorrow. And now, because I'm working at home, I can go back 5 slides if I wanted. And those work and family boundaries, right, are very problematic. And so we're in trouble, right? We're getting the worst of both worlds. I falsely believe that there is no limit to the amount of time I have. But then when the deadline comes, I have too many other things and distractions, and it's really hard to focus and get it done. And so it has never been more important to publish deadlines as early and quickly as possible, and also to check in. And this is where you're going to annoy your superstars. I know. Why you bother me? You don't do this when we're at the office. But it's important, because if you don't, as executive directors, as department heads, etc., it will bite you in the rear end, and you're going to miss some things that are really important in terms of time, and that's how we get there. Okay. Also, Nicole asked me, how would you handle when an in-person school opened, but you have staff that opted to keep their kids in virtual school, but we're planning to get back to the office? It's not the best work outcome at times for them. Do we have to allow them to stay? So that's another legal question. I see where some of you all are ready to go. I'm getting there, I promise. The answer, by the way, just very quickly on that one is no. They actually are not entitled under the EFMLA. If your school, if a parent's school opens a brick and mortar, offers a brick and mortar option, and also a virtual option, and they say, I'm not going to send my child to brick and mortar, I want to stay home and I want to collect my 2/3 pay, et cetera, you have to allow me to. The law has actually been clarified at the end of the summer. No, as an employer, you do not. Certainly you respect an employee that says, I just don't feel comfortable, but they don't have any legal right inherent in that decision to stay home or to collect any additional money. So just so I don't get too far behind on that, Nicole, that's the quick answer there. Okay, good. All right, overcoming the challenges. Let's fast forward 2, please. One more. All right, so a couple things here. Be clear, okay? Zoom calls are good, but I also now I'm going to flip, just like I was criticizing the email. What I want you to do is when you're doing Zoom meetings, much like when you do in-person meetings, is that when you're done, okay, make sure you're doing the follow-up email and you're writing down the things that you agreed on, in particular the actions that you just agreed on in that meeting. And I want you to do this even if you don't normally do it in in-person meetings. Why? Frankly, because virtual communication, every study shows, is not as effective. People don't hear as well as they hear in person. I don't mean actually like audibly, I mean in terms of it sinking in, as they say. So very important, what I've done with my staff, because we're still all completely remote, is that when we're talking about doing a training, we're talking about how we're going to handle a client, I am now taking an extra 5 minutes after those calls, and I send a follow-up email saying, here's what we agreed we're going to do. And that has helped me greatly keep people sort of on track. And in advance, I'm always talking about what the goals are, on a weekly, a monthly, quarterly basis. Accountability, the idea of check-in points. The next one's important, how to interact. Okay, so this kind of goes back to the whole efficiency problem. And that is, pre-pandemic, you all liked each other, I hope. Like, you spent time together. You went and, had lunch together, sitting around the lunchroom. Didn't that feel like 100 years ago now? It was actually fun, We've forgotten all of that. And so now, in many situations, our relationships have also become flat. And all it's about is getting the job done. The sooner I can get all these emails out, the sooner I can check the boxes. Hey, I'm at the house. I get to have more time with my dog and my family, et cetera. And so we're losing ground in terms of the relational capital that we have within our workplaces. And so I'm telling you this as leaders because you have to see that distinction, okay? Yes, all the work-centered emails, all the work-centered Zooms, blah, 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 blah. Like, got to check all those boxes. But y'all, if you're great leaders, you're also taking time every week to invest relationally into your folks, okay? And oftentimes that is a whole separate call. It doesn't have to be. Sometimes it's, I really need 10 minutes on this call. I allow myself 20. And for the first 5 minutes, you know what? We kind of moan together. How many of you moan together, right? Like, we moan together and say, I'm really hitting that wall. Like, I'm feeling depressed. It's been really rough. Bill, I'm sorry. I was there about 2 weeks ago, and I wish there was some quick answer. For me, I take my dog and I pet him, and silly as that sounds, like, he's therapy for me. It's little small talk that I think sometimes we're like, yeah, why do we waste our time on that? We as humans need each other. We all have different beliefs about, the greater universe and all that stuff. But I'm telling you, the one thing I think we all agree on is that we have to be around one another. And that's been really tough on all of us. It matters at work. Make relational time. Performance goals. Y'all, this is something a gift that I want to give to you. I think you know this, but when you create goals, okay, especially in the pandemic, every goal has to have 2 things, okay? And I've taught my daughters this from the time that they were young. Number 1, you have to be able to see whether or not you did what you set out to do, okay? It's called tangibility. It has to be measurable. So when you're giving people assignments or goals or performance evaluation, feedback, whatever it is, it has to have that tangibility. I always teasingly say, if I go to the grocery store and I go without a list, I get Oreos, Doritos, and Mountain Dew, and I get in trouble with my wife. But if I go with a list, I get the bread, the eggs, the cheese, and sometimes the Oreos too, but I stick to it, right? That stick-to-itness comes and flows from leaders. Each one of you need to be creating that, okay? Especially in the pandemic. Here's what we're going to do. This is how we measure success. This is the outcomes that we were talking about earlier. Second piece of the goals is there's a time certainty. And again, much like I mentioned the procrastination piece, you all need to be very intentional about when you're expecting certain parts of projects to be turned into you, certain calls that will be made. Whatever those things are in a given job, today, working remotely, we have to be more structured in terms of what we're expecting. So take that advice, that the idea of doing really good goals, and focus on that right now. It's a huge advantage. Okay. Let's skip over to, let's go to the communication slide. One more, please. Communications, okay? So making sure that we have the right tools. On this one, I'm going to tell you this. Actually, if you go back where it says one slide where it says communications, there we go, sorry. On this, I just tell a story on my sister-in-law. She is a very high up. I see what Susan said. My husband just become a much better grocery shopper. Give him that list. Okay. So, but my sister-in-law, who's an amazing, like high-flying professional in a major urban area. And what's happened is she has just found when she went, their office went remote, that she had 2 extra hours every day because of her commute time was gone. Just like I mentioned, for many of you, that's true. And so, at first my wife and I were teasing like, wow, like Karen, what are you going to do with all this extra time? And we saw her recently and I said something to her husband and he said, Bill, she is absolutely miserable. I said, really? And he said, yes. He said, she never stops working. She's taken that 2 hours of found commute time and she puts in 4 to 6 extra hours every day. He said, she falls asleep with a laptop in our bed. She never has that phone outside of her hand. And my sister-in-law, Karen, is a great reflection on our society at large right now. And y'all, we have to care and love our people. In some situations, some of your employees are taking advantage of you. I mean, just to put it very bluntly. They're not working the way that they should be working or the way that they used to work when they were in the physical work site. But you have others who are very passionate about the movement and the work that we do. And this is actually now put them into overdrive and they will burn out. They're going to burn out emotionally. They're going to burn out physically. And I'll bet most of you know who that is in your respective staff. And so I want to tell you that you need to be intentional about making sure that they have time away, that they are shutting down that laptop. And in some situations, we've had clients that have actually used, I don't know how this stuff works as techie, but like they shut their emails off in essence where they can't receive any emails or send any emails during a block of time. That's 2 reasons. One is practically is one to burn out, but 2 is if they're non-exempt, right? That means that they have to be paid for every minute that they work. And so people who are working 10 and 12 and 14-hour days and only getting paid for 8, that violates federal law. So just be mindful of that piece as well. And I see where we're at. We have about 10 minutes left. Let me jump to a couple of the legal points because I can sense that some of you on the line based upon the chat questions want to talk a little bit about the law. And so one little practical side on this, when we're doing corrective actions, God forbid when you have to terminate somebody, right? Especially in this economic climate, it's weird. It's really weird to quote, write somebody up on Zoom. So what I'll tell you, a couple quick hitters on this, which are number 1, we never should be punitive to begin with. But right now, you definitively don't want to be punitive because you're not around the person. And if it doesn't go well and the communication doesn't go well, they are going to really, really hate your guts because you have no immediate opportunity to be in person and to sort of warm up and to kind of let some of that ice melt, as they say. and it's bad. It's really bad. The use of those goals. So a lot of the stuff we're doing now, we've actually in some situations walked away from our formal kind of corrected action template, and we've gone more to a memo style. It's a little softer in terms of the presentation, but we always include those goals. Just what I'd shared just a few minutes ago, the corrective actions, the performance intervention are very, very goal driven. I think they always should be, but right now in pandemic, we're doing that. And so if all of that fails and you're terminating somebody, what I would tell you, two little practical points: the witness matters. Somebody else from your organization better be on that line. And the other thing is, if you're doing it via like a Zoom and you're recording it, don't forget, in almost every state represented here today, it is illegal to record a conversation without the person's consent or at least notification that it's happening. So be smart. There's some weird nuances in corrective actions and terminations right now. So let's talk a little bit about this idea of the new laws, the pandemic laws, okay, with the few minutes that we have left. And this goes back to, let me see, Susan's question, I think, yes. So what happens when you all are now preparing to migrate back from a virtual or remote work site to your normal place? This is happening a lot today. And so someone says to you, well, that's fine for everybody else, but I'm going to have to take a pass. Well, you're very gracious and kind people. That's why I love working in the nonprofit world. You're going to ask them, well, tell us, do you have COVID symptoms? I don't. Does anybody in your house have COVID symptoms? Nope, they don't. Do you have a child that can't go to school because there's no brick and mortar option? No. Then I need you to come back to work. Either be here Monday or you're fired. You wouldn't say it quite like that. Well, here's the little rub, and that is that some of your employees, okay, either are trying to kind of pull one over, or frankly, just really are anxious. And what they're saying is, I actually have anxiety, clinical anxiety. And I went to my psychiatrist, and I've got a note here that verifies I have a disability, and it says right on it that I need the reasonable accommodation of working remotely. Okay. Now what? Well, again, you ADA gurus on the line, you know what, right? What does the law say? It says, can the person with a disability perform the essential functions of the job with or without reasonable accommodations? So let's break that down. If the job in question, right, has an essential function that requires in-person behaviors or in-person actions, for example, I have to have you there because you're, the collaborative partner with such and such, and we've got to start doing presentations again, whatever it might be, well, that's an essential function. And therefore, if there is no reasonable accommodation, it would create, what's the other phrase that we know? An undue hardship in our ability to be able to provide the service to the participants and the clients that we serve. So that's how that works. And you go, yeah, I know that. But remember, it's good to know it, but it's quite another thing to actually implement that, meaning that we're going to document the fact that we looked at the request through an ADA lens, okay? And so I hope that helps explain that just a little bit. Let me see here. I've got another one. It says, one part I find critical is to be able to read body language. This might just be a comment. Looks like it's a comment. And Maria offers a boomerang comment. What if their child is 14 to 17 and can be left home alone and the school's closed down? Do we need to allow them to work from home? So one really important thing for everybody on the line to know is if you're small, and many of our centers, some of you are not, but many of the centers on the line are very small, right? And you have less than 50 employees, okay? You can claim the small business exemption, okay? And that is the idea that we are so small that allowing someone to stay at home and care for their children would create, again, back to that phrase, an undue hardship in our ability to provide that service. So the EFMLA is the new law. I would do a memorandum to file that kind of explains that, that says to them, not to them, but to the file, we only have 8 employees, and therefore it would be impossible for us to continue to maintain this work from home status. We are claiming the exemption under the EFMLA. Most of our folks try to negotiate the best we can, but Jody, it's a good question. Where I am, I'm actually in Tallahassee, Florida today. In the last 3 days, we've had 2 of our largest schools decide to close their brick and mortar completely. And it looks as though they're going to be virtual until such time that a vaccine comes. It's starting to be a little more of a national trend. A lot of the teachers' unions, there's lots of conversations about protests and walkouts and all the rest. And so I don't think we're through it yet. I think a lot of people thought, oh, Labor Day, and as long as it doesn't go crazy. Look at the numbers, y'all. You're seeing some pretty big stats now. You're seeing an increase over the last week in the number of COVID cases and COVID deaths. It's probably not a terribly good sign. And I'm an optimistic person, but I'm simply saying you're going to see some of that happen. Looks like we've got some just logistical things there. What else can I cover with you in the short few minutes that I have left? Well, feel free to, again, pop up any other questions that you like. I do want to say this to you, though. This is really important, and that is that you all understand that you, as you return to the physical workplace, nothing matters more than having a good standard of care, okay? Staying within the proverbial herd, making sure that how you require people to wear masks, right, really matters, y'all. Social distancing really matters. And if you assume risk, right, you do things that are outside the herd, meaning what others in your area and others within our industry are doing, and something goes wrong, somebody gets sick, or God forbid somebody dies, we'll face a negligence-based suit. That negligence-based suit oftentimes has no insurance coverage. And you're talking about hundreds of thousands, oftentimes millions of dollars that are at stake. And so I know everybody has a different opinion on things like masks, but when you see an employee who has their mask here and the mask should be here, you're first going to say something nicely to them. The second time, you're going to do a corrective action, okay? That's how serious you have to take these simple things that everybody knows how to do. Why are we doing this? Not because of politics. Frankly, at the end of the day, for me, because of the potential liability and the type of case that ends the existence of our agency. So that's how aggressive I want you to be on that front. Pay attention to the CDC when it comes to when somebody who tests positive for COVID can come back. They just changed that standard about 5 or 6 weeks ago. It's a bouncing ball. It keeps changing. They're the ones that are governing and dictating what is the herd, what is the standard of care. So I know that wasn't our topic today, but I can't help but make sure that I convey that to everybody that I run into. So I think we're out of time. Please, we're going to go ahead and put up my slide, my last slide. But if anyone has any questions whatsoever, you need support, you need help, don't hesitate to email me directly or call our office. Be glad to get you more information relative to any particular concerns or particular needs that you have. But thank you so much for the privilege of presenting today. I hope that you all stay safe, and this too shall pass. This too shall pass.